Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to your May Lunch and Learn webinar. My name is Shireen Retta. I'm the chapter coordinator for NASW Minnesota, and you are here for I graduated. Now what? 5 things every new social worker should know. I'm really excited to be presenting today, actually, along with my esteemed director, Karen Goodenough. You want to say hi, Karen?
Esteemed, I love it. Hi, folks. Great to see you all here today.
Yes, and I did forget to mention my pronouns are she and her. So this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube page following the end today. We are asking that you share your questions and your hopes for today's webinar in the chat with us, and we'll do our best to address as much as possible through the presentation. And we'll also be sticking around at the end to do a little bit more Q&A. The idea for today's webinar came from a couple of places. First, wanting new social workers to start off in the profession informed and ready to go, and also from the types of questions that we are often asked here at the chapter, even by the most seasoned social workers. So Karen said this a couple minutes before we actually got started, but there are no silly questions. It doesn't matter if you're just getting started or if you've been in practice for decades. All the information that we're going to share with you today is relevant, and we get questions about them all the time. Go to the next slide, Karen, please.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so what are the 5 things that we're going to talk about today? So this is your little preview. We're going to be talking about licensure. We're going to be talking about supervision. We're going to talk about continuing education. We're going to cover the job search. And we are going to talk about where you can find support. So we will start with licensure. Can we go to the next one, please? Thanks.
All right.
So yeah, that's you. Sorry.
I will take it away. Okay, so
Yes.
The first thing we're going to talk about today is licensure, and several of the questions that are coming up in the chat now are related to licensure. So I'll cover a bunch of things, and then as we go through today, I'll go back and see if we've answered everything, but you guys are asking some really good questions. So first of all, I want to say that licensure is different in every state, okay? So if you're in Minnesota right now and you're choosing to move somewhere else in the country, there's nothing wrong with getting licensed in Minnesota, especially if you don't know if you might move. If you're not sure yet, then I want you to get licensed in Minnesota, okay? But know that every state has different rules and regulations, and that is true for every profession. Licensure is one of those things that our federal government devolves to the states. So every state gets to decide who they license and what that looks like. Now, some fields, professions have done a really good job of aligning across the country, and others have not. And so we're getting better in social work, but it's definitely different in every state. What I would say is that licensure in Minnesota has all of the levels of licensure possible, except for a very particular macro license. Our macro people still do have to be licensed, side note, but all of the exams that exist for social workers exist in Minnesota. So they're requirements for Minnesota social workers. So if you take any exam while you're in Minnesota, that exam score can go with you to another state, okay? I'm gonna go through a bunch of details here, but I'll try to cover some big buckets before I dive into the details. And I just want to say right up front too, because there's a lot of misunderstanding around this. I hear from people things like, I'm not sure if I'm going to get licensed. And I want to make sure we're really clear that in Minnesota, if you have a social work degree and you do anything that looks, smells, or seems like social work, unless you're in an exempt category, you have to be licensed, okay? So if you're getting a social work degree, it's not a question. You have to get licensed when you are done with school. If you're going to do anything that seems like social work, even if the title of your job is not social worker, and your employer doesn't care if you have a degree or a license or not, or they would have hired you if you had a different degree, it doesn't matter. The social work license follows the trained social worker, not the organization, not the job description, none of that. Now, in terms of exemptions, and I'll say this a couple times, so I want to make sure everyone's super clear. In Minnesota, our current exemptions are our students. So if you're in an internship, you don't have to be licensed, which is true actually in most states, not all. Our county workers are exempt. So if you work directly for a county, you can be legally unlicensed, okay? And that's one that we're working to get rid of actively. So that's a longer story for another day probably, but so we have the county exemption, and then anyone who works for a federally recognized tribe is also exempt from licensure. Now, many of our tribes do have their own licensure. Some of it mimics state licensure, but it's important when if you go work for a tribe that you are really clear about what their licensure requirements are. Okay, but basically licensure is not a choice. And this includes both direct practice and macro practice and just about anything in between. So teaching, policy, leadership, all of those things in addition to direct practice of all sorts is counted in our Practice Act, in our definition of social work practice. Let's see. If you don't get licensed right away and you get turned into the board somewhere along the way, which ethically we are each obligated to hold each other accountable to licensure. So you could get turned in somewhere along the way, or if there was, say there was an ethical complaint filed against you and you didn't have an active license and the board found that you should, then you could be found in, out of compliance with licensure. And the time when people often get sort of found out is when you go to get a license. And you're finally like, oh, I got a job and they actually care that I have a license and I need to have it. And you don't, and you go to get licensed. The board will ask you questions about where you've worked and what you've done and that sort of thing. And then you will get fined for all of the years that you were practicing unlicensed. So that's basically what happens. It's not that you can't get a license, it's that you'll end up having to pay the fees for, and they're not fines in the sense like they're above and beyond licensure fees. You're basically paying for the licensure fees for all of the years that you practiced without a license. So just a reminder in terms of caveats, we are talking just about licensure in Minnesota today because that's what we know about. That's in our scope of practice. So if you live or work outside of the state of Minnesota, we urge you to go to your state's licensing board to ask good questions. Most of what we'll talk about today is actually on the Minnesota Board of Social Work website, and you don't need to memorize it, especially not all the numbers and things. You can look up things over time. Most social workers use that site often to look things up. And we're also going to speak more generally, not COVID specific, because we do have a couple of very specific time-limited variances going on right now in light of COVID. Those things we can talk about at another time as well. But just a note that basically all of your questions and like the final answer to anything having to do with licensure should go to the Board of Social Work, not us. We are the board, we're NASW, we're the National Association of Social Workers, Minnesota chapter. So we're your professional association. The board is our regulatory agency, okay? And also just a note that the board has lots of new videos up on their website on several important aspects of licensure. So I would encourage you to check them out for specific questions and things that you're looking for. All right, let me go over what are our social work license types in Minnesota. So at the top of the slide here, you see with a bachelor's degree, you become a licensed social worker or an LSW, okay? And that's all you can do at the bachelor's level. Once you have a master's degree, then you become an LGSW, a licensed graduate social worker, okay? Now you can stay an LGSW forever if you'd like to, once you've done your 2 years of supervised practice, or you can choose to move to the LISW or the LICSW levels. But just a note that, so for example, I'm an LGSW. I will stay in LGSW my whole professional career unless in Minnesota we choose to have a specific macro practice license, okay? The LISW license, which Shireen is also with a master's degree, is a licensed independent social worker. It's an advanced generalist license. Does it require an additional exam? Neither of those levels, once you've done your 2 years of supervised practice as an LGSW, and we're going to talk about supervision in a minute, so I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but you don't have additional requirements other than taking an additional exam to become an LISW. Or you can become an LICSW. Now, there's an arrow going from LISW and from the LGSW down to the LIC because both LGSWs and LISWs can become clinicians or become clinical social workers at the LICSW level with some additional work in there. So let me see if I've covered everything I wanted to here. Just to be clear, our LISW is not a macro license. It's for social workers who are non-clinical practice. And you know, it really depends on the work that you want to do, where you go with that master's degree and with your licensure level. But the base rule is everyone out of school from graduate school becomes an LGSW, and you can choose to move toward the clinical license or not, okay? All right, now in terms of getting licensed, now, as I said, all of our Minnesota licensure goes through the Minnesota Board of Social Work. We call it the BOSW, the Board of Social Work. So when people use the lingo like, you should talk to the board about that, they don't mean my board. They're talking about the Board of Social Work, okay? They're our regulatory agency. Now, the Board of Social Work does not serve social workers. Like, their job is not to look out for us. It's not to speak on behalf of the profession, that sort of thing. That's our job at NASW and our professional associations. The Board of Social Work's mission is to protect the public by overseeing social work licensure. So they're a government agency. Licensure is set in law, and these folks work for the government. They are hired by our government to oversee licensure. Okay. So again, lots of people are like, why doesn't the board do work to make sure we get paid better, or to make sure that, you know, we have better working conditions, or like all those things? Not the board's job. Absolutely not in their job description. That's the kind of stuff that your associations do. Okay. So when you apply for your license, you're applying through the Board of Social Work. Anything to do with them goes through the board. The application process for any license, any of those levels, involves submitting documentation like application form, transcript, getting a background check done, attesting that you're going to adhere to our ethical standards as a profession. The NASW Code of Ethics is in our legislation in Minnesota that you're signing off that you're going to practice ethically based on those standards. You do have to pass a licensure exam for each of those 4 levels of licensure we talked about, and you have to pay a fee. And I also want to make sure people know, like, part of that decision making about, you know, from an LGSW, that graduate social worker, to an LI or LIC, each of those have different fees to them. And so that's part of my decision making too about staying in LG. I keep the lowest licensing fees I need to pay as a social worker, graduate level social worker in Minnesota. Let's see. For the LSW and the LGSW, so if you're just coming out of your bachelor's degree or you're just coming out of your master's degree, you also need to submit verification that you've met your supervision hours requirement when the time comes. So that's basically 2 years. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then for the LICSW level, there's also this additional requirement of clinical clock hours. We're not going to go into lots of detail on that today, but as you're moving toward the clinical license, you'll have lots of questions about things like the clinical clock hours. So that's something very specific you should be looking into. Now, your licensure is renewed every 2 years by the end of your birthday month. So if you say my birthday's in March, right, and I take the exam coming up here, say I'm just graduating, I take the exam in June. So my initial license starts in June. My renewal period will be 2 years later, but in March, in my birthday month. So I'm going to have a little shorter period. So actually my first licensing fee will be a little less than it will be in the couple of years after that, because they'll only charge you for the months that your license is active for. So every 2 years at the end of your birthday month, you're going to pay a fee, and you're basically going to check some boxes. So you're going to do it online. You're going to do your renewal online. You're going to pay your fee, and you're going to attest that you've kept up with your licensure requirements, that you've practiced ethically, those sorts of things over the last couple of years. So there's some standards of practice questions, and you're just going to go down them and click yes or no, and then submit to the board. Let's see. Make sure you stay on top of that. Renew on time. Again, the board is a government agency, so they will charge you fines and fees if you don't do your stuff on time. There is no way around it. They're very rigid in their processes, and they have to be for fairness sake, make sure that it's equitable across everyone. And so there's not a lot of like special you know, agreements made and that sort of thing. You have to take care of your paperwork on time and that sort of thing to avoid late fees. You are eligible to renew your license beginning 45 days before your expiration date, and the board will email you a reminder that it is time to renew your license. So just a note, folks that are used to getting those postcards in the mail, those postcards will not necessarily always be the way. So make sure that you're paying attention to the timeliness. Make sure that your email address is always updated with the board, and you should always make sure your mailing address and things are updated with them as well. It's great now, all of it is online and you can update it at any time. So make sure that you take the time to do that. All right, so a couple more notes about, why licensure is important in Minnesota. So as I had said earlier, social work license is required in Minnesota. If you have a social work degree and you work in any job that looks, seems, feels like social work, you have to be licensed, not optional. We talked about the exemptions that exist. They're listed here, our interns, county employees, and federally recognized tribes. It's really important for us to just, when I think about why licensure, it was social workers in the first place across the country that worked very hard to get licensure, okay, several decades ago. And actually Minnesota was in about the midway point timeliness of across the country when states were passing licensure laws. In Minnesota, we first got licensure in 1987. And so it's pretty new, actually. It's not actually been around that long. But it was specifically social workers who fought for licensure in order to establish ourselves as a profession, to look out for ourselves, especially in terms of, for our clinicians in particular, to be able to compete in the clinical sphere. We have to have licensure and all that goes with it in order to have billable services, that sort of thing. So there's lots of reasons for licensure, but it definitely does some, sort of acknowledging of the significance and the impact of our profession, helps to ensure that we carry out our practice ethically and competently and with integrity. And so those are the things that the board is looking for, that people are practicing in those ways. And it's a way for us to have a system of accountability as a profession and for the public to hold us accountable if we mess up. So that's our main space where people can make a complaint against someone, and the Board of Social Work takes those seriously. And we can talk about that at another time, but I definitely don't want to over worry you about what it means to be licensed, and are all my clients going to go and complain about me and that sort of thing. That is absolutely not the case. But there are protections in place so that if there are bad seeds out there in the world practicing social work, that we all want us all practicing ethically and competently. And if we have people who are not, we want them to be checked for that and potentially not have a license, that sort of thing. So the other thing I would like to make sure that new social workers or people, freshly coming in, maybe with a new level of license to remembers that we have title protection in Minnesota. And title protection means that the use of our professional title of social worker is restricted only to those who meet specific qualifications, right? So that's not a national title protection. So it's not true in every state, but basically because we have it in Minnesota, it means that no one can call themselves a social worker who does not have a degree in social work. Now, the only caveat to that, again, because we have the county exemption, is there are people doing the job of a, quote, social worker who don't have a license. Whole nother thing, again, we'll argue that one on a different day. But generally, you should not see people out in the world practicing social work without a degree and calling themselves a social worker. And if they do, you should call them on it. And when people say things to me like, well, I'm basically a social worker, I say, well, do you have a social work degree? Or do you have a license? Because they were brought in with licensure, maybe when we first got licensure or when we got rid of an exemption. And if they don't have a license and they don't have a degree, then I say, then you actually can't call yourself a social worker or basically one. And we all need to hold ourselves accountable to that. And I also think you all need to call yourselves social workers. That's also a really important thing to protect the profession, is that when people get you, They don't get Karen Goodenough, who's an executive director, or Shireen Retta, who's a chapter coordinator at NASW. That means nothing. But they get Karen Goodenough, who's a social worker. And I say I'm a macro practice social worker, and I am the executive director at NASW Minnesota. And I hope you'll all do that your title is not first. Your professional space is first in your description of your professional self. All right. I think I covered everything I needed to there. Shireen's going to keep me accountable if there's anything I miss along the way here. Just a couple quick notes about our exams. So they are national exams. So they're the same 4 exams across the country at the different levels. But again, not every state has all of the exams as requirements. Okay. Our board will approve you to take it. You have to pay a fee basically to take the exam. It's a computer-based exam. You get 4 hours for 170 questions. And just a note that only 150 of those actually receive scores. 20 of them are practice questions. But you do them at a Pearson Learning Center, and there's some pictures there of what the little carols look like. It's a little rough of a process, let me say it that way. Those of us who struggle, and I'm one of those with really bad test anxiety, it's not a great experience, I'll put it that way. But you will be fine, and you will be even finer and feel better about it if you do some things to prepare, like take our license exam prep course. We have a great course that we offer several times a year. We've got another one coming up at the end of, when's our next one, Shireen? End of May, and then another one at the end of June?
May 26th, June 24th.
Okay, cool. So we have license exam prep courses coming up. So if you're interested in those, check them out. They absolutely will make you feel better and be more prepared for the exam. There's also ASWB offers practice exams out there and study guides and things like that. So lots of things out there to help you prepare. Next up, we're just going to talk a little bit about supervision, what it's for and how to get it. All right. And we're talking about supervision for licensure today, not general supervision for employment. So this is not about who's your supervisor at work. This is about the supervision requirements for licensure. So there's some differentiation on your slide here about non-clinical and clinical practice. So for non-clinical practice, so this includes LSW, so the bachelor's degree folks, and those LGSWs who are pursuing non-clinical practice. It's a one-time requirement, 100 hours over 400 or 4,000 hours of practice, which basically averages out to 4 hours a month while you're working full-time. If you're working half-time, then you only have to accrue those supervision hours at half of that rate. So 2 hours a month, say if you're working half-time. Our clinicians have this ongoing requirement until you obtain your LICSW. So for example, if you finish your years of your time of supervision, but you haven't taken that LICSW exam yet and passed it, then you have to keep getting supervision until you pass that exam. Okay. Now our clinicians have to get 200 hours of supervision for 4,000 to 8,000 hours of practice. And just a note that some of this will likely be changing in the next year or so. I'm working with the Board of Social Work on our Legislative and Rules Committee to make some updates to our licensing laws. Again, we made a bunch of updates to refresh things and bring them into the current century and that sort of thing last year. And the supervision requirements are next up for us to be working on. All right. So that's sort of what is supervision. Now, when you think about that supervisory relationship, kind of where do you get it, who these people are, that sort of thing. So really the point of it is to promote competent and ethical practice, helps you develop as a professional, and it can happen inside or outside your agency. Okay. It can also be one-on-one or group, potentially, I should say, and or group. At least half of your supervision hours have to be done one-on-one, so you and your supervisor. The other half of your hours could be done in a group. There are some limits to how many people can be in a group, that sort of thing. But my 2 cents to you is I would really encourage you to do both, to get some one-on-one supervision and get some group supervision. It's a really great way to learn from other professionals, especially if you're getting supervision outside of your agency. It can be a really nice way to meet some people who are working in other areas of practice, get some outside perspective on your work, that sort of thing. So group can be really cool. And just a note that all licensure supervisors have to complete 30 hours of initial training. And some of those hours people get when they're in school. So if any of you took a course that was some kind of, supervision course, leadership course that included supervision content, that sort of thing, many schools are offering that now. That can count toward your 30-hour requirement to be a supervisor. And every renewal cycle of your license, you'll have to complete an additional 6 hours of training in supervision. So that's nice. When you're looking for a supervisor, those people have some training at least in their pocket. We're actually right now in the middle of, we do a 30-hour supervision certification training, and we just started our second cohort yesterday, and the first half of the course is Essentials of Supervision. It's 15 hours. And the second half is Advanced Supervision, and that's another 15 hours. And it's a great way to get those 30 hours if you're looking for them. So something to look for along the line. Now just note, you can't supervise other people until you're done with your supervision requirements yourself. So nothing for you until you're done with that for you to be thinking about. But there are some people who are getting close to their 2 years, and they're like, ooh, I want to get my 30-hour training in so I can start supervising people. Now, in terms of how you can find a supervisor, there are lots of ways to do this. Now, in the ideal world, the place you work will have a supervisor that's your boss, your employment supervisor, who is a licensed social worker at the correct level, who's completed the 30-hour training and can be your licensure supervisor. That would be the ideal situation, okay? That does not happen for everyone. There's lots of creative ways that organizations go about this. One option, if it's not available at your agency, is for you to find it outside of your agency. And I would always encourage you to negotiate with your employer to make them pay for it, because it absolutely makes you a better practitioner. And so it's one of those great things when Shireen's talking later about, what to negotiate up front, or one of us is talking about later, what to negotiate up front. That might be one of those things that you want to negotiate up front, is to make sure that your supervision is paid for. But if you're looking for a supervisor, great ways to find them are talk to your field instructors from your internships, talk to faculty at your schools. If you're an NASW member, absolutely reach out to us, because we keep a list of people who are looking to supervise folks. And just know that if you are looking for supervision outside of your agency, then you will likely have to pay for it unless you've got a personal relationship with someone and they're willing to do it. The going rates on that can vary drastically, anywhere from like $40 an hour to upwards of $140 an hour for clinicians. I would encourage you to negotiate the rates. And again, that's a great reason to do group, because it can help keep your costs down as well. So happy in all of these things. Every one of these could be a whole workshop in themselves. So we're going kind of quickly, but feel free to reach out to us if you have more questions about any of these topics we're talking about. And with that, we're going to move into thing 3 on continuing education, and Shireen's going to take over.
Thank you, Karen. Great. So thing number 3 is continuing education. What counts and what's required for you as a licensed social worker? So as social workers, we know that there's always something new to learn. So to keep our knowledge and our skills and our practice growing and improving constantly, we're required to continue our education. There is a really nifty video on the Board of Social Work website that covers what I'm about to cover. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Can you go to the next slide, please, Karen? So I'm going to call them CE instead of continuing ed as I continue. So just know that CE refers to continuing education. So CEs are an ongoing requirement for all licensed social workers, even if you're not in a social work position. Just think of it as social work license, CE requirements. So in order to keep up your social work licensure, you need to fulfill all the requirements that come along with that, including continuing ed. And continuing ed activities are anything that promotes the standards of practice, social work, or advances the profession in some way. In Minnesota, each CE, so like one CE is 1 clock hour. So it makes it really nice and easy to translate your CE number to hours. What we are required to do as licensed social workers in Minnesota is get 40 CEs. So that's 40 hours of learning per renewal period. So that's a requirement that applies to all social workers. At least two of those 40 CEs need to be in some kind of ethics content. If you are a supervisor, 6 of those 40 CEs need to be in some kind of supervision content. Again, that's minimum 6. And if you have a clinical license, you are an LICSW, then at least 12 of your 40 need to be in clinical content. And you are not able to double dip. So you're either counting it as clinical or ethics or supervision, or you're not. The content of your CEs, so like the topics, the subject matter, is really up to you and your interest and your area of practice. So there might be some specific activities that are required by your job or your organization. They might say you need to be well-versed and trained in motivational interviewing or whatever the case might be, and they might send you to a training for that, and that can potentially count towards your CEs. But beyond that, as long as you're fulfilling these requirements, they can be anything that contributes to or informs your practice in some way. Can you go to the next one, please, Karen? Great. So some of the things that can count towards your continuing ed. Academic coursework completed after you are licensed can count towards your continuing education requirements. I think that there was a question about that in the chat earlier. If you have a social work license and you are in an academic program, perhaps depending on what the content is, but a social work program, 1 semester credit counts as 15 CE hours. Other things that can count towards your continuing ed requirement are educational workshops, seminars, conferences, or live webinars like this one that we're in right now. Staff training that's provided by your employer is another example. And up to half of your CEs can be done through independent learning. So what is independent learning? Anything that's non-live, non-interactive. So things that you do on your own time, hence the name, basically. So that includes things like watching this recording on YouTube. Hello, people who are watching it later. This is an independent learning activity for you. Doing research for publication, working on a presentation that you're going to give, other types of professional development, even watching educational videos like a TED Talk, if it's relevant to your practice, can be counted as independent learning. Listening to a relevant podcast. So I like Code Switch. Like, yeah, this is relevant to my practice. That can be counted as independent learning as well. So if it's advancing your practice in some way, you can definitely count it towards your continuing ed requirements. And that way it's not always a matter of like, I need to go to trainings and I need to pay for my continuing ed all the time. But there are lots of ways that you can get creative in how you get your learning done and how you fulfill this requirement. Next slide, please. Okay, so it is really important that you keep a record of your continuing ed. Okay, so how to track your CEs. You do this so that you know that you're meeting your license requirements and in case you're ever audited by the Board of Social Work. What type of documentation do you need to keep? Well, most professional trainings will provide you with a certificate of completion. That's what we're going to do for you folks who are joining us live today. You will get a CEU certificate that marks the number of hours completed and the subject and the presenters, etc. For other CE activities like a staff training or any of those independent learning activities that we talked about before, videos, podcasts, we really recommend taking some good notes on what you've learned and how it applies to your practice. That's a really good way to document that you actually completed the activity in question. So if you were to go and watch this video or listen to a podcast, the provider can't actually give you a certificate of completion. In some cases they can if it's a particular entity or things like that, but like Code Switch can't send you a certificate of completion. That's something that you're going to need to track on your own. So it's a good practice to get into with independent learning, continuing ed, to just jot some notes down. How does this apply to my practice? What did I learn? And then keep that along with your other CE documentation. Which we recommend actually keeping in one place like a folder. I actually have mine right here. Ooh. I keep all my continuing ed certificates and notes in one folder so that I can count how far along I am towards fulfilling that requirement and if I'm ever audited by the board. Important note, alert, you do not need to send your CE documentation to the Board of Social Work or to NASW. Okay, again, this is for Minnesota licensure that I'm talking about. I don't know how it is in other states, but a common misconception, even among seasoned social workers, is that they need to send their CE certificates into the board either at renewal time or after it's been completed. They need to send it off to NASW. That is not true. You keep it for your own records for a year following your renewal date to submit to the Board of Social Work if you're ever audited. Next slide, please. Right, we're moving into thing number 4, jobs. This could be a whole webinar on its own. I think that's probably the case for any of the things that we've talked about so far. But what we're going to focus on in this section is really helping you master the job search and kickstart your career off on the right foot. Next slide, please. So we want to talk a little bit first about how to prepare for the job search. Job searching is inherently stressful. I will say that. But there are lots of things that you can do to prepare yourself to crush the interview and land your ultimate dream job. So we have a few tips lined up here for you. The first one is to clean up your social media. So we talk a lot about social media in our practice. Employers definitely look you up. Do not try and fool yourself. Oh, nobody's ever going to go to that extent. I've seen it done. So you will really want to take a look at your public online presence and ask yourself, is this hireable? Is this what I would want a potential employer or a supervisor to see? Try Googling yourself or looking at your social media profiles in the public view to see what you come up with. And you may end up wanting to make some changes to how your settings are set up or just cleaning up that presence in general. We'd also recommend updating your LinkedIn profile. As I said, employers are definitely looking you up. So why not have the professional networking social media profile all set up for them to take a peek at? They can see your past experience and what you're following. You want to find a professional photo of yourself to post on there or get some pictures done if that's available to you. If that's not available to you, I'm really excited because I've learned this week that there are lots of things on like TikTok, for example, of folks teaching you how to take a professional selfie. This is very exciting for me as someone who likes to save money. So I'm probably going to be updating my LinkedIn profile picture pretty soon. You'll also want to refresh your resume. It's a really good time when you're, if you're graduating or if you're looking to transition in your career, to just take another look at your resume. How long has it been since you've done that? We want you to add your graduation and licensure information, include your internships, include volunteer work that's relevant to social work practice or to the job that you're seeking. You want to make sure that everything is consistent on there. The font, the format, there are some really, really cool templates that can help you to stand out. And it is a really good idea to have a unique looking resume, not too far out there, but anything that can help you stand out as employers are scanning through piles of resumes is a good thing. When people used to do paper resumes, I used to print mine on thicker paper so that when they were rifling through it, it felt a little different. And then they would hang on to it for a second and take a closer look. Psychology. You don't want to overload what's on your resume. You want to be concise, just make it a page or two. And another tip that I've learned recently is that you do not need your high school information on your resume. Take that off of there. Sometimes employers are looking for a reason to eliminate you from their pile. So you want to do everything you can to not give them that reason. So as you're applying to jobs and getting prepared to apply to jobs, you want to keep track of contacts that you're making and all the applications that you've submitted. You never know when you're going to get a call. Networking is also a really great way to make connections and to learn about available opportunities. So we're encouraging you to get on listservs of organizations that you would love to work at or that you think are doing really great work. We want you to attend their events. We want you to reach out to their staff, follow them on social media. You can also remain in connection with your professors and your classmates to see what they're up to and see what kind of connections they can help you make. My first social work job actually came as a direct result of my professor who was also doing my license supervision. So you never know who is going to help you get your foot in the door and when. I think another really important one is to get comfortable talking about yourself, your accomplishments, your strengths, your areas for growth, what your goals are for your career. This is something that, depending on whether you're new to the job search process, or maybe it's been a while since you transitioned positions, you might need to work on talking yourself up a bit. How do I talk about what I've done? It's become such second nature to me. Is there a way that I can talk about this in a way that would be really appealing to an employer? Next slide, please. Great. So, oh, there's one more thing that I actually didn't mention on the prepare, and it wasn't actually on the notes there, but I'll say this. You do not want the same cover letter to be submitted over and over and over again as you're applying for jobs. That's a really strong recommendation that I would make, is you want to modify your cover letter to suit the job and the organization for which you're applying. I'd really encourage you to do your research and look into what's their mission, what's their vision, what are their organizational values, how do they talk about the issue that they're working to address and the folks that they serve. You want to use their language so that you become a more appealing candidate to them, rather than submitting like a form standard cover letter to the same employer over and over again, which ends up being really non-specific and not very intriguing to the hiring manager. So just want to throw that out there as well. So coming back to finding a fit, it's really important in your preparation process to know what your negotiables and non-negotiables are. So you have things that you need to pay for. You have commitments in your life. How will your job support your life and your endeavors? So I want you to think about making a list and decide what's important to you. What are your needs? These can be things like, I need to be making a certain amount of money in order to cover my bills. I need to have really good health coverage because I have a condition, or I need my prescriptions every month. It needs to be, you know, on a public transportation line or in a particular city. What has to be included in the jobs for which you're applying? This really can help you narrow down, like, what are the things that I am willing to do and the things that I am not willing to do in terms of jobs that I will seek. And then you want to think about your wants versus your needs. What are the things that would be nice to have? You know, a career path. Is there opportunity for growth? Is there a particular practice area that I want to be working in? Are there particular skills that I want to be using on a regular basis? What are my professional goals? What would be nice to have? This could also be something like, they provide a licensed supervisor for you. I want to be supervised by a social worker. I think that would be nice. That would save me having to look for a licensed supervisor outside of my job, potentially paying more, et cetera, et cetera. We also, in terms of finding a fit, it's really good idea to ask questions of your potential employers. Karen knows this about me. Whenever folks are applying for internships with us, I am always paying really close attention to what kinds of questions are they asking, because it just shows a certain level of engagement in the work that's being done. How connected are you to and familiar are you with the work that's being done here? What are your goals for the future? What are your interests? It gives the employer a sense of who you are and what you might bring to the position. So you can ask these questions in advance. Maybe you know somebody who works there. Maybe you contact them on social media or respond to a listserv message that's been sent out. Maybe you set up an informational interview to kind of get some information ahead of time. But then when you're in the interview, we really want you to ask really thoughtful questions that show your interest, basically, and that you're engaged in the job search process. Finally, on this one, we want you to know your value. What do you bring to the job that other people don't? And how does that add to your value, both monetary and, I guess I'll say, non-monetary? The first thing that I'll say is, you're a social worker. You know, Karen alluded earlier, own that profession loud and proud, because there are certain things that come along with being a social worker that don't come along with other human services or social service degrees or education. For example, licensure. You are a licensed professional and you abide by a code of ethics. You are held to certain professional standards. There's an accountability system in place. You have a certain level of education. You are getting ongoing continuing education. You are required to be supervised. All of that adds to your value and what you are uniquely able to bring to the job. You might also have additional skills or certifications that contribute to that value. So we want you to be thinking about that in terms of how it'll get used in the jobs for which you're applying. And then also when it comes to things like salary negotiation, or actually, let me rephrase that, the negotiation of the compensation package, because it is not all about the salary. Other things may be just as important, if not more important, as part of a whole package when you're looking for a job. Okay. Let me just add a couple more points here before I turn it back over to Karen. It's really a balance when you're looking to find the proper fit. You know, go beyond your comfort zone in terms of what you're applying for. When you're reading those job requirements and you see, you know, X number of years of experience, oh, I don't have that. But maybe some of that experience can be filled in by your internship placement, or maybe the level of education that you have makes up for that. So we want you to, you know, go for the jobs that you reasonably believe, like, I could do this, even if it doesn't fit nice and neatly into what the job description says, because sometimes those skills are translatable, or that education can translate as well. We also want you to recognize when it's not the right fit for you. Again, asking those questions, learning about the organizational culture, how do they do their work? What are the things that are of value to you in the work that you do? And how will you know if a place is going to be a good fit for you or not? You're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. I know I remember what it's like to be, you know, a new graduate. Like, I just got to get a job. I got to pay my loans. I got to, you know, you kind of like, there's a desperation that can sometimes come along with that, but we don't want you to lose that wonderful critical thinking that comes along with being a social worker. Like, wait a minute, is this going to be a good fit for me in terms of what I need to do and what I want to do? And of course, there are always exceptions to that. Sometimes we just need to get working, but it's just something to think about in terms of maintaining a balance. I think I will just finish there.
Thanks, Shireen. All right, and I will jump in and I'm going to talk a bit about the job search itself and sort of where to look and what to do. And as Shireen was just talking about, you know, it is really important that you are your own best advocate through the job search process, that these people don't know you. And they can't sell you, only you can sell you, right? And I know for a lot of us, especially if you're just a very humble person, pretty quiet, like you're not one to sort of boast about all your stuff, you got to check that. And you have to start being the boaster. You have to be your own best advocate. The other side to that, as Shireen was saying, you know, when you're looking at position descriptions and that sort of thing, and you're wondering, like, should I apply? Am I the right? Do I know enough to do that? I want you to really think about having to know about half, maybe 20% to a half of what actually is required in the job, and the rest you can learn when you get there. And I know that's hard for some of us, right? Especially females. And the research on this is really gendered, so I'm going to use really gendered language here, and I'm aware of that. But the research shows that men will apply for jobs when they know at least 10%, and women will apply for jobs when they know at least 90%. And you wonder why men get more of the good gigs, because men are like, I could do that. I could learn that. I could figure it out, right? And so I want to push everyone in this room and say, I want you to look for the things that you're interested in doing, that you know you're capable of doing, whether or not you can go down the list and check them off and say, I've done them, or I can prove to them my skills in this area. You don't have to be able to do that. So that's just my push to you. In terms of, job search, like how to go about it, there's lots of places you can go. So there's things like Indeed and Handshake and Google Careers and those sorts of things. But I want to say all of those national platforms do nothing in relation to local platforms and person-to-person contact. So in Minnesota, the best place to look for a nonprofit or other human services related job is the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits website. Minnesota Council of Nonprofits website, MCN. okay? They've become the place because, first of all, anyone who's a member can post there for free. And the other great thing about it is they have new requirements where in order to post there, you have to post the salary of the job, which is actually really important for equity and diversity and inclusion and that sort of thing. But being forthright about what the salary is helps you as the potential employee be able to filter out where to spend your energy in the job search, but also it makes more sense for everyone. So I encourage you to check out MCN. People who move to Minnesota from out of state who really struggle with job search, these are a lot of the same things I will tell them. And many of them don't realize MCN's a thing. And once they do, they're like, oh, that's where all the jobs are. I also want you to really think about informational interviews. And I know that can be overwhelming for some folks, but I want you to think about, who's already doing your dream job or works in an organization that you'd love to work for. And I want you to reach out and ask for a few minutes with them, whether it's on Zoom or maybe someday again in person, to pick their brain, talk about, tell them you're interested in the kind of work they're doing and you're wondering what ideas they have about who you should talk to or how you could get it into the work. People love to talk about their knowledge in this kind of stuff. So people can be pretty open about it. Check out organizational websites, subscribe to their mailing lists, network, and then just really expand your search, right? Find things that are interesting and spread your wings out a little bit. Make sure that you're meeting all of their requirements, right? Ask really good questions. If they specifically say you have to complete this form in order to move on, you have to complete the form and make sure you answer all of the questions and make sure you submit a cover letter if they ask for it. And there's nothing worse than just not even being included in the pool because you didn't complete one step of the process. Shireen talked a lot about negotiation. I would just encourage you to do that work. Once you are their chosen person, that is the time for you to negotiate for yourself because at that point they want you. You are their top person. So again, be your own best advocate in the process. Our last thing is support. And I'm going to move fairly quickly through this one because we're at the end of our time. And there are a few questions in the chat that I was hoping we would come back to. But I just want to make sure everyone, and there was one person actually in the chat that was asking about self-care, but self-care is support, right? Taking care of yourself and paying attention to what you need is all what all of this is about and becoming a professional. But your support system is crucial and it can come in lots of forms. It's time for you to start thinking more about who are your supervisors, your mentors, who are those people, your peers, your professors, your people that you're going to go back to and ask questions of along the way. And just a note too, that pool of folks will grow and change constantly throughout your professional career also based on what you need and where you're at, and it will grow. So don't feel discouraged if you haven't made as many connections yet as you'd like to, but now's the time to start making more and more of those connections. We have lots of professional resources, the Board of Social Work resources there, their web link, and then also use us at NASW to help support you. We do all sorts of things to help support new social workers. We talked about some of our continuing ed. We do some networking events, which more of those will be coming up. We have our exam prep course, and NASW members also get all sorts of things like job board access. We're happy to help with resume help, career exploration. I'm happy to meet with people individually and help make connections. I also would really encourage you, if you're an NASW member or if you're not yet, join right before you graduate if you haven't yet, because you get the cheap little student rate and you get to then have a graduated rate for a couple of years. And then get engaged with us, join a committee or a work group, talk to me about joining the board next year. That it's a great way to start meeting professionals who are in other areas of practice. I see Labiba's with us today, one of our fantastic board members, and great way to start making those professional connections beyond your college or university as well. So I think it is 12:58 and we cruised through your 5 things. I'm going to put up our contact information here, and then we're going to stick around for just a few minutes and answer a few questions. And if people have to leave, feel free to jump off at any point. But I want to just thank you all for being with us today and asking good questions along the way here. Many of the things you posed, we covered as we went, but I want to reiterate some of those answers here quick. Can I go ahead and get started doing that, Shireen?
I just want to add one thing before you start
Okay.
doing that, Karen.
Yeah.
For folks that need to leave, you will receive your CEU certificate. Yay, check one, and a link to the evaluation for the session shortly after we wrap up here today. We really do appreciate if you could take a few moments to share what you thought. We use it to inform our programming and our services. And I wanted to also just check back in, Karen, are we going to be stopping the recording to take questions from folks unmuted? Will that be after you cover what's in the chat?
Nope.
Okay.
Let's leave the recording running so that the answers get in for anyone who watches it later too. So if people have additional questions, if you don't want your face or your voice to be heard, go ahead and just drop your question into the chat so that we can record the answers there too.
Great. Thanks for being here to those who have to leave.
Absolutely. For those of you who are not licensed yet, okay, you have not taken your exam and all that sort of thing, you're not licensed yet, you don't need CEs yet. The CEUs, CEs, whatever we call them. So don't feel, you don't have to start collecting those things because they won't count until you're fully licensed and you get that thing from the board that says, yep, you're good to go. And now your CE requirements start and you have this much time to get this many CEs. Until you have that, you don't need them yet. So don't worry about those little pieces of paper. All right, so CEUs for people who carry a social work license or who are dually licensed. So Shireen said earlier, one thing that I think is important to reiterate. One is if you're currently a student and you are licensed, your classes count as your continuing ed. So you don't have to go to workshops outside of going to class. You can count those hours. In terms of being dually licensed, if you're a social worker and an LADC or a social worker and something else, usually our CEs count for both, and you can duplicate count across boards. They don't check with each other. So if you went to a training that counts for both licenses, count it under both, okay? But check with each licensing board to verify what their requirements are. You know, some require ethics, some require supervision, some require, you know, all the different things like that. Or maybe they don't take independent study, or maybe, you know, those sorts of things. So each board is different, but if they follow the same general rules, then you can duplicate count them there. In terms of, someone was asking about clinical versus non-clinical tracks and advancing from the LGSW. Is it necessary to seek higher licensure for a non-clinical track? It is not. So again, if you are an LGSW, so you're a graduate level social worker and you do your 2 years of supervised practice, you can be like Karen, be like me, and stay in LGSW forever. Or you can be like Shireen and take the LISW, the advanced generalist exam, and become an LISW, but that's a choice. You can choose to do that if you're a non-clinical, okay? All right, we talked about that one. We talked a little bit about preserving work-life balance, but we kind of whooshed right over it. You know, I think that is one of those things that we have to consistently come back to, all of us, all of the time, is our work-life balance. And then the world changes and your plans change and life changes. And so it's something you have to keep coming back to all the time. I do think that setting up new, like establishing new sort of rules for yourself and new habits as you step into a new role or as a season changes, you know, many times along your life, it's a good time to sort of reframe and rethink your work-life balance, that sort of thing. So, I mean, I think having good rules for yourself about what time you start work and what time you stop work, and I would say being really clear about your personal devices and how much you are going to allow your work life to touch your personal devices, right? So I have the kind of job where I don't really get a choice. Like I have to be connected all of the time, but it doesn't mean I have to respond all the time. I get to make choices about which things I respond to and when. I also think there's a lot of non-judgment going on right now and rethinking of these things in light of many people working from home, right? So if it works for me in my life for me to work at 11 o'clock at night because things are quiet and I have some stuff I want to get done, I can do that, right? But you can even set up your technology so that my emails don't send out that moment. I can set them so they go out Monday morning at 8 o'clock. And nobody knows that I did it Saturday morning because I wanted to, right? So I think there's things like that that you can even set up for yourself that helps other people say, okay, just because I'm emailing you doesn't mean I'm encouraging you to work all the time, right? But I can have good limits on that too. The other thing I want to say to all of you too is that you have to have your own work-life balance and your own rules because your employer will not be good about setting them for you. That is true for even the best employers. Like people say to me all the time, I'm going on vacation and I have a couple meetings I'm going to go to while I'm on vacation. And I am like, absolutely not, right? Because the reality is your boss will likely let you go to those meetings. They'll likely let you work on said project while you're on vacation or while you're taking a sick day or whatever it is. But you have to set those limits for yourself, and nothing is that important really at the end of the day, as taking real time away. Like that is so important. So my 2 cents on you have to give that time to yourself because your employer will not force you to take it most of the time. All right, I'm scanning down to see what else I am seeing. We talked a little bit about documenting supervision hours. I put an answer in the chat, but for anyone who's listening to this too, to document supervision hours, I recommend making a spreadsheet, save it online or in multiple places, put it in a Google Doc or some place that's out in the world so it doesn't get lost when you lose your computer. You know, we all used to keep it in a notebook, but you're going to lose that notebook somewhere across those 2 years that you have to keep it. So for those 2 years of supervision, take notes in one place, put the date, how much time you spent, and bullets of what the content was for that day, the quick agenda items. You do not need detailed notes on what was covered in supervision, just the general buckets of things. Let's see. The supervision hours need to be submitted to the board? Yes. So you'll be attesting that you completed your supervision hours, but that documentation, just like your CEUs, could get audited. And so you need to have some backup of how many hours you did and when you did them.
Karen, if I could just add to that, I had put a response to that. That there are actually some forms that you need to complete. So I don't know if we're talking about supervision training or supervision at like supervised practice, but there are some for supervised practice, what you need to submit forms to the Board of Social Work, and I've linked them in the chat, that show that you have completed your supervised practice hours, and your supervisor or supervisors will actually sign off on that as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. No, that's a great point, Shireen. I was just saying you don't have to send the backup of the hours with that form. Yep. You're just attesting on there that yes, but yes, there's a very specific form that you'll complete to prove that you're out and say that your hours are complete. You'll also do a supervision plan with your supervisor that you'll turn in up front. And one of our attendees has a good question about how many supervisors you can have for your licensure supervision. You absolutely can have more than one licensure supervisor. I would recommend, and I don't know if there's a rule, Shireen, about having more than 2, but many people have one supervisor for their individual supervision and one supervisor for their group supervision. That's a very normal sort of thing to have. The other thing that happens a lot also is you don't have to have the same supervisor over your full 2 years. So if you start with one person and either it doesn't work out or they move to a different job or you move to a different job and for whatever reason you have to switch supervisors, it's totally fine. You should do a supervision verification form with the person you close out with. You do a new supervision plan with your new supervisor, and it all continues on. And at the end, you have to have a total number of hours between all the different supervisors and types of supervision that you got. All right. I'm just seeing is there anything else? Where are we able to get a salary range to be able to negotiate a salary? That's a great question that I answer actually often to people who call me for consultation on job search stuff. I have this great book. I'm going to grab it really quick. You can still hear me talking. I'm just going to show it to you. The Minnesota Council of Nonprofits puts out this salary and benefits survey, Minnesota Salary and Benefits Survey. Okay. This version is the 2018 edition, but people can order this from the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. Okay, so it's a great way to get local salary information. It also is something that if your agency is a member of MCN, they get a couple of free items each year, and many of your organizations choose this one because their HR department is interested. So you might be able to find a copy through an organization. Some libraries even carry them as well. But if you're looking for salary ranges and want to just run something by us, I'd be happy to answer individual questions with people too. And just to note that you may have to do some searching and some research in order to figure out what the going rate is. And that's another reason to do lots of informational interviews, because people in the world are forthcoming with things like this. And they might not tell you how much money they're making, but they might tell you, you could ask questions in those informational interviews like, what do you think the average salary is? Or what have you seen people making in this type of role? So it gives you a sense of what to be looking for and kind of where your range might be falling as well. In terms of, let's see, someone's asking, they've graduated with their MSW and have passed the LGSW exam. When can I start supervision? As soon as you start a job is when your supervision starts. If you're not working, you're not collecting supervision hours. You can't be supervised when you're not practicing. So again, as soon as you start a job, your supervision hours, not only can they begin, but they must begin within, I think it's 30 days of starting a new job. You're supposed to have your supervision lined up. There's a little flexibility on that, but to get things worked out, but I encourage you to get that figured out early on. And let's see. Any other specific questions anyone has or things that we missed along the way? I know Shireen's been answering some of these also. So 4 hours a month of supervision, someone was asking that for new people coming out of school. Usually we recommend that people do like 2 2-hour chunks. So individual 2 hours a month, group 2 hours a month. Some employers and some individuals prefer an hour at a time. The rules, there's also rules about how much of it has to be done in person, eye to eye, they call it, or eye to eye electronic media like this, where we can see each other. And all that to say, you should check with the board and pay attention to changes that come out next year, because there will likely be some changes to the requirements, and partially that we're trying to make it easier for people to get their supervision hours by either electronic means or over the phone as well. So hoping to expand what's in place right now temporarily.
I'd like to just add a couple of things as we're kind of closing up here. So first, I put a link to the supervised practice section into the chat. What I was going to add is I will really encourage folks to get familiar with, AKA not be intimidated by, the Board of Social Work or NASW. They're just people. This is something Karen says all the time. We're just people. The board are just people doing our jobs. The Board of Social Work website has improved a lot since I initially became licensed, and the information on there has become much more clear and continues to be so. So you shouldn't have any trouble finding the information that you're looking for. And if you do, you can send them a message. You can ask us and we can try and find it for you. And just know that if you have questions about anything that we've talked about today, we are here. If you remember that support slide, we are here for you. We're serving our members and we're serving all social workers in Minnesota. So if you have questions, please reach out to us and we're happy to support you along your career journey and as you're getting started as a new social worker. To those of you that are graduating, welcome to the profession. We are happy to have you.
Absolutely. And congratulations. And we're thrilled that you are joining us as social workers. So with that, I think we should close up. I really appreciate all of you being with us today. We will have the recording available. So if your colleagues want to watch it, you can send them to the recording we'll get out on our YouTube channel. So follow us on YouTube also. And if you're not already, follow us on all of our social media, especially Facebook, where we put all sorts of different things from the chapter. Appreciate you all. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.